There's a paradox in Viking life that almost sounds made up. These people survived nights so cold that your breath could freeze the moment it left your mouth. Yet they didn't rely on anything we consider essential today. No endless firewood, no sealed fireplaces, no modern heating of any kind. And here's the part that still makes archaeologists pause. The Vikings didn't fight winter. They became part of it, as if they were using some kind of northern physics magic that only works in sub-zero darkness. In a world where 30 degrees Celsius could kill someone in just a few hours, the Vikings stayed alive using things we'd normally shrug off as useless. Thick kitchen smoke drifting through the longhouse, body heat from the people sleeping beside you, the faint warmth trapped inside turf walls and a living grass roof. None of these are powerful on their own, but together, they formed a survival system so illogical you'd never believe it came from a society with no problem. Formal science. They didn't beat winter with brute strength. They beat it with cleverness by understanding how hot air moved, how drafts slipped into earthen walls, how human breath and body heat could build up and become a real heat source. So if you've always imagined Vikings as rough warriors swinging axes, it might be time to look again. They were also silent engineers of the cold people who learned how to bend winter to their will without using a single piece of metal. When winter swallowed all of Scandinavia and the darkness stretched on with no clear end, the Vikings understood something most people today overlook. Their most dangerous enemy wasn't the cold or the wind, it was isolation, and the fear that quietly fills every empty corner of the mind. And in that seemingly hopeless landscape, the longhouse emerged not just as a home, but as a social survival machine built to keep people safe from both the cold and the creeping madness of winter. Under one roof, stretching dozens of meters, everyone from the chieftain to the lowest laborer lived together in a single shared space. Their breath mixed in the air, conversations traveled from one end of the hall to the other, and the constant rhythm of tools, weaving frames, whispers, arguments, and late-night stories kept the communal fire alive, even when the real one dimmed. It sounds simple, almost primitive, yet this closeness is exactly what astonishes researchers today. Dozens of bodies radiating heat inside a semi-sealed space created enough warmth to raise the temperature of the entire hall. And the emotional bond, the shared purpose, kept them grounded, preventing them from slipping into the winter depression that still challenges people in northern climates today. The longhouse, in the end, wasn't just shelter. It was a psychological fortress, a place where every person was anchored by their role, their tasks, and the simple, powerful presence of the people around them. There's a truth that feels completely backwards to our modern instincts. While we today chase privacy and personal space, the Vikings understood that distance could kill them long before the cold ever did. And here's the twist that still stuns researchers. A packed longhouse thick with smoke, breath, bodies shifting in the dark was actually the most effective artificial heating system Northern Europe had ever created. Each body acted like a small furnace. Placed together, they formed a sea of heat that even some modern, poorly insulated homes can't match. Reconstruction experiments show that with just 40 to 50 people living and moving in a closed hall, the temperature can rise more than 15 degrees, even while freezing winds batter the world outside. The funny part? The Vikings had no concept of a body heat system, no scientific terminology, but after generations of surviving darkness and frost, they had instinctively mastered a principle that modern science only named much later. Instead of running from the cold, they gathered tightly together, turning their own presence into a shield against winter. And what makes it even more remarkable is how they kept that heat alive. Men repairing tools, women weaving, children listening to sagas, every tiny movement feeding energy back into a space that needed it desperately. If you were living in Viking times, could you handle the idea of relying on someone else's breath just to survive a winter night? I'm genuinely curious, do you see this as a strength or a weakness of humanity back then? Drop your thoughts below. What many people misunderstand about the Viking longhouse is that they picture it as a crude wooden hut, when in reality, the truth is the complete opposite. A longhouse was engineered like a thermal bunker, a massive natural thermos, built from earth, grass, timber, and pure survival instinct. The walls weren't just walls, they were a wooden frame packed tightly with wattle, mud, and clay, then covered with a thick layer of turf that could reach nearly a meter deep. And when winter snow piled on top, that snow, something we normally see as a symbol of cold, became an additional insulation layer, trapping warmth rather than letting it escape. The roof worked the same way, birch bark for waterproofing, then a heavy, dense blanket of grass acting like a natural lid, holding in the rising
Have you
heat from
told
the
them the
hearth and from the
story of the
people
raven?
inside. With
Not
low
yet, my
doorways,
dear.
no windows, and only a single smoke vent in the roof, the entire structure was sealed so tightly that even a light breeze struggled to slip through. But the most surprising twist is this. None of those features were accidental. They were the result of centuries of
wrong?
watching how wind moved,
I am
how
tired.
earth retained moisture, and how heat disappeared. From the outside, a longhouse looks like nothing more than a mound of grass and dirt.
Coldest.
Inside, it behaves like a living
More wood
thermal
is needed for the
machine.
fire.
If you put a modern house next to a Viking longhouse in the middle of a blizzard, which one do you think would hold heat better? Among all the survival secrets of the Vikings, the one that shocks researchers the most isn't found in their weapons or their longhouses. It's worn directly on their bodies. Their clothing system, which at first glance looks rough, bulky, even unattractive, was so effective that modern outdoor gear would think twice before competing with it. The astonishing part is that they didn't try to create one thick coat.
What is
Instead,
this place?
they built an entire physical mechanism around the body, a fully mobile thermal architecture. The first layer was always linen, a simple-looking fabric with a hidden superpower. It pulled moisture off the skin and pushed it outward, preventing the dangerous wet-cold effect that can drop a person's body temperature in minutes. Over that came layers of coarse wool packed with natural lanolin and animal oil the Vikings intentionally never washed out. That lanolin turned their wool garments into a primitive, water-resistant jacket, able to withstand hours of snow and sleet without soaking through. But the real genius was their use of air. They allowed tiny pockets of air to sit between each layer, and when those pockets warmed up from body heat, they became the true insulation, performing on the same principles as many modern high-tech materials.
It's so
A
hot
heavy
and
outer
stuffy
wool
in here.
cloak sealed everything in, blocking the wind
Welcome back
and
to the
locking the
cold,
entire
brother.
thermal system together.
The
From
snow is
afar,
deep already.
they might just look like
The
people
gods
wrapped in
favor
rough
the warmth
fabric.
tonight.
But in terms of heat engineering, they were walking around wearing a fully functional thermal structure. At the center of every Viking longhouse burned something both familiar and almost mythical, a long, glowing strip of fire they called the langel. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than a line of embers running down the middle of the hall. But once you understand how it works, you realize it isn't just a fire. It's the living soul of the community, a small, glowing guardian that kept people awake, alive, and sane through endless polar nights. The first thing that surprises most people is that the langel wasn't meant to burn high. Viking flames stayed low, long, and steady, prioritizing even heat over dramatic
Gotta
flare.
get out of here.
That stretched out shape created a continuous heat distribution, allowing dozens of people to warm themselves, cook, work, and rest around the same source without anyone being pushed to the cold edges. In regions with few trees, they even burned peat, a slow-burning, smoldering fuel that glowed like the patient heart of the northern winter. Its smoke rose through a small vent in the roof, a structure that seems primitive, but actually allowed just the right amount of ventilation, enough to keep the air breathable, yet tight enough to hold precious heat inside. But the most remarkable part is how the Vikings understood fire. They saw it as a thread connecting the living to their ancestors, a keeper of memory, spirit, and family fate. Letting the fire die wasn't just dangerous, it was considered a bad omen. So the langel was always tended, fed, and guarded like a breathing creature, a silent deity fighting back the darkness. If you had to live in a longhouse filled with smoke, dim light, and that slow, steady fire, would you find it comforting or frightening? I'm genuinely curious what your real feeling would be. What shocks most people studying the Vikings' winter diet isn't the scarcity, it's the bizarre, almost unbelievable food hacks that ended up keeping entire communities alive through months of darkness. The most famous example is stockfish cod dried in the freezing wind until it becomes rock hard, so tough you literally need a wooden mallet to smash it into edible pieces. And yet, it was their most reliable source of protein, lasting years without salt, smoke, or any kind of preservation. Their meat techniques were just as surprising. Instead of curing or freezing it, they hung cuts high inside smoke-filled longhouses, letting the smoke saturate every fiber until the meat turned into a kind of stone meat, nearly impossible to rot even in damp, bone-chilling weather. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so they fermented it, strained it, dried it, transforming it into cheeses and skyr that could outlast an entire winter. Grains were dried carefully and buried deep under frozen soil, while root vegetables were stored in underground pits, where the temperature stayed more stable than any primitive fridge. All of it sounds like improvisation, quick fixes for desperate times. But in reality, it was a sophisticated storage system built on the very things nature threw at them: cold wind, heavy smoke, frozen earth, and time itself. When the world outside sank into a darkness so thick you could barely tell day from night, the Vikings refused to let winter turn them into silent shadows. They transformed the longhouse into a miniature universe of activity, where the faint glow of animal fat lamps swept across the room like a doorway into a parallel world. Those tiny lamps filled with fish oil or seal fat, their wicks twisted from moss, didn't shine brightly, but they were enough to illuminate every small miracle of winter life. The pull of a wool thread, the careful carving of a wooden handle, the warm breath rising from the cloth that would soon become sails ready to meet the spring sea. In those moments, the longhouse stopped being a shelter and became a creative workshop. Every hammer tap, every snip of iron scissors, every simple melody plucked on a lyre helped push back the feeling of being swallowed by endless night. Rare free time was filled with sagas, those sprawling, unending stories that doubled as entertainment and a lifeline to myth, memory, and ancestors. Even hennefateful boards came alive as mock battles in the dark, sharpening their minds and keeping their spirits anchored through the longest season of the year. While much of medieval Europe was still indifferent to the idea of hygiene, the Vikings, often labeled as barbarians, were quietly building a cleanliness system so advanced that many historians now describe it as a cultural counterattack. And here's the dramatic twist. These rugged seafarers, bearded warriors who spent months on the ocean, took weekly steam baths in the Bad Stofa, shaved, groomed, cleaned their ears, and were even buried with bone grooming kits, as if declaring that neatness was part of their identity. Inside the longhouse, they regularly changed the straw flooring and washed their wool with an alkaline solution made from urine, a method that sounds brutal but is astonishingly effective at breaking down oils and odors. Even more shocking are the accounts of Ibn Fadlan, who met them in person and admitted that Vikings combed their hair every morning, a small act, yet striking enough to make southern traders both curious and wary of their surprising tidiness. Their steam bath rituals weren't just about cleaning the body. They doubled as information hubs, political meeting rooms, and alliance-building spaces. In that sense, hygiene became a form of soft power, a subtle but undeniable flex that set Viking communities apart from the rest of medieval Europe. There's a moment that every person in the Viking world waited for with almost breathless anticipation. The first sunrise after months of darkness, a single blade of light cutting through a wall of ice and night. And that small shift reveals a truth we often forget. Winter wasn't an ending for the Vikings. It was a silent forge, a ruthless training season that prepared them to explode into spring with a level of speed and readiness few civilizations could match. When the fjord ice cracked open, the ships they'd been repairing all winter, every plank replaced, every rope retwisted, were dragged into the light like warriors rising from a long sleep. The heavy wool sails, woven in the dim glow of winter lamps, now billowed in the sea wind, announcing the return of trade, exploration, and open water campaigns. On land, the pace quickened instantly. Plowing began. Soil opened again. Grains were sown. Everything they had stored, planned, repaired, and crafted through the winter activated at once. Life accelerated in a way only those who had endured the long darkness could understand. The Vikings knew they couldn't thrive without respecting nature's rhythm. Winter for building strength, summer for breaking limits. That complete harmony with the seasons was their true source of power. Looking at how they lived, what do you think mattered more, endurance or preparation? I'd love to hear your thoughts after this journey. And if you want to keep exploring the survival secrets of ancient civilizations, feel free to subscribe. Consider it stepping into the next longhouse with us.